All right, this will be your first lecture for week 10. Please don't forget that you will have 2 lectures this week. We have to double up at least 1 week this semester. So we pushed blood and cardiovascular in together since those two things kind of go together. And this is the week that we're doing that. So please don't study chapter 10 and forget all about chapter 11. This PowerPoint will go along with the chapter 11 part of this week. So for this PowerPoint, we're just talking about blood. The functions of blood is to transport oxygen, hormones, nutrients, um, signaling molecules to all the body cells all over the body. Also to transport CO2 and other waste products from cells so that we can eliminate them from the body. To maintain the body temp, right? Our blood is what moves that heat all the way through our body that we need to maintain our temperature. It also helps us maintain pH by carrying pH buffers around to keep us from getting too acidic or too alkaline. It maintains our fluid volume and our blood pressure and prevents blood loss. So we know that whenever we get a cut or a wound, we get these blood clots that stop the bleeding from happening and scab over and all of that. So the blood actually also helps keep the blood inside of us. And the last function we're going to talk about is that the blood helps to prevent infections because the blood has white blood cells and also antibodies. We're going to split blood into 2 main components. The first is going to be plasma. That's going to account for about 55% of the blood. This is going to be about 90% water. It's also going to have ions, proteins, gases, nutrients, waste, and hormones. This is what we think of as being the liquid portion of the blood. We're also going to have blood cells, and that's going to account for about 45% of the overall blood. This is going to be our red blood cells, our white blood cells, and our platelets. Remember that these develop from stem cells in the bone marrow. We talked about this when we talked about bone, that process of hematopoiesis. I just put this slide in here because it's really a lot of really good information to know. So here's your breakdown of blood into the blood cell components and then how all of those break down, and into your plasma components and what all is it within that plasma. I don't need you to necessarily memorize all of the little ions and nutrients and all of these things, but it's just a really nice table that I thought would be really helpful for your studying. Something that I do want you to know is this table up top where it talks about the different components. This is this little test tube in the middle. The reason that it is here is because whenever they do labs on blood and they put something in like a centrifuge and they spin it around, they end up with this plasma layer on top, and you can see this really thin one in between. When your book talks about a buffy coat, that's what it's referring to. So this is where like your white blood cells and your platelets are going to be, is in this little thin layer of buffy coat, and then the bottom is going to be your red blood cell or your erythrocytes. So that's good to know. Another thing that I want to touch on, as always, is how important our science vocabulary or our medical vocabulary is in letting us know what a word is if we're not quite sure on it. So when you see this word part, agglutinin, that means to glue together or to make things stick together. Embol means stopper. Erythro means red. Hemato means blood. Leuco means white, and thromb means clot. So you will see those as prefixes and suffixes on words, and seeing those will help you figure out what those words mean. And these all apply to the cardiovascular system and blood specifically. Let's talk a little bit about blood cell formation. Again, this is hematopoiesis. This is blood cell formation, and it is going to happen in the red bone marrow in our skeletal system. This should not be new information. We covered this when we covered the skeletal system. I just want to touch on it again because your book talks about it. Let's talk about red blood cells, or erythrocytes. The primary function of red blood cells is to transport oxygen to all of our cells throughout the body. They are these little biconcave discs, which is what is meant by this round shape with almost like a little indentation in the middle, almost like a donut, but without it coming into an actual hole. They are anucleate. That means that they have no nucleus that we can see under the microscope. The lifespan is about 100 to 120 days. Whenever you see a blood count in the hospital, you'll frequently see something on it called hematocrit. Typically, you will see hemoglobin with hematocrit. Hematocrit is going to be the percentage of those RBCs by volume in the sample of the whole blood. We want this to be between 35 and about 55. That's kind of the sweet spot for that. Hemoglobin is going to be an iron-containing protein in red blood cells. The function of hemoglobin is to be the chemical component that is going to bind to oxygen to carry the oxygen through the body from the lungs to the tissues so that we can get that oxygen perfusion to keep our body going, because we need that oxygen in order for those tissue cells to be able to do glycolysis, which makes ATP, which creates our energy for the whole body, right? So we have to have oxygen to our tissues to survive. Hemoglobin is the protein that does that job. It also grabs a hold of CO2 and carries it away from the tissues all the way back to the lungs so that we're able to breathe it out and get it out of our bodies. Let's talk a little bit about red blood cell disorders. You've probably heard of these before. Anemia is going to be a decrease in the oxygen carrying ability of blood. This can be due to a low red blood cell count or low hemoglobin content. Sickle cell disease is going to be an abnormal hemoglobin protein in red blood cells. It's a genetic disorder that is caused by inheriting 2 copies of that mutated hemoglobin allele. And yes, I'm fairly certain you've probably heard of both of these before. That's as in-depth as I'm wanting you to get with them. If you want more information on those things, just for your own information, holler at me and I will talk to you a whole lot more about them. Leukocytes, these are our white blood cells. These are going to defend the body against pathogenic infection and sometimes cancerous tumors. They can move to areas of the tissue damage by responding to chemical signals that are put out into the bloodstream. We're going to have 2 different types of these, granulocytes and agranulocytes. We talked about this a lot in the lab. So whenever we see these that look like they're a little sandy in the middle, right, these are our agranulocytes. It really means that it looks like there's little grains inside. Within these groups, then we will have our neutrophils, our eosinophils, our basophils, our lymphocytes, and our monocytes. And your book breaks those down a lot more. I put you a table here that shows more about their actual function, like that our neutrophils take care of bacterial and fungal infections. These are going to be our first responders to microbial infection. That's important information to know. They are the highest percentage of our white blood cells. So about 50 to 70% of our white blood cells is neutrophils. Our eosinophils, these help us deal with parasitic infections and allergic reactions. So this is going to be our inflammatory response. They are a very, very small percentage of our white blood cells, being only about 1 to 3%. Basophils help handle allergic and antigen responses. So these release histamine. The histamine then causes the blood vessels to dilate, which makes the blood go to the tissues faster. These are a very small percentage, actually our smallest percentage. These are only about 0.5% to 1% of all of our white blood cells. Lymphocytes, these are going to include our B cells in the immune system, our helper T cells, and these are going to operate primarily in the lymphatic system. We also have monocytes. These are going to be the ones that do that phagocytosis of pathogens. We talked about that a little bit before. Eventually, they will become tissue macrophages, which remove those dead cell debris and attack microorganisms by literally engulfing them. These are going to be about 4 to 6% of our white blood cells. Let's talk about white blood cell disorders that you might see if you go into something medical. Leukemia is a common one. This is a bone marrow cancer. Leukopenia, this is the fancy science way of just saying that you have a low blood cell count of white blood cells specifically. This makes it a whole lot harder to fight infections. And then HIV, this is going to be the infection that attacks the type of white blood cells known as T cells. And if you know anything about the immune system, you know that T cells are incredibly important in that response. Let's talk about platelets. This is another component of blood. We also call these thrombocytes. Remember, throm means clot, right? These are little cell fragments and they are irregularly shaped. This is this little yellow guy here in the middle. We need these to be able to make our blood clot. So whenever you see thrombocytes, the very first thing you should think of is clotting blood. It is a very important function in this system, and they are totally responsible for it. So really important stuff here. Okay, let's talk a little bit about hemostasis, or the stopping of bleeding. The very first thing that is going to happen is a vascular spasm. So vasoconstriction, that blood vessel is going to get smaller. This is going to reduce the blood loss because not as much blood can flow through a small vessel as a large vessel. After that, there's going to be a platelet plug that is going to form. Those platelets are going to stick together and bind to the damaged site. This is going to release clotting factors to attract even more platelets. So this is when our clot really starts forming. Then we're going to get coagulation. At this point, a fibrin protein is going to start to form threads that's going to make kind of like a little mesh that's going to trap even more red blood cells. And then the blood clot at that point is fully formed. Let's talk about clotting disorders, and then we're almost done. So a thrombus, that is when a clot forms in an unbroken blood vessel. And an embolus is when that blood clot breaks away from the vessel wall and floats freely through the bloodstream. Another clotting disorder that I think your book talks about is hemophilia. This is going to be a hereditary bleeding disorder. The reason for this is because people with hemophilia lack the protein clotting factors that are needed to form clots. We did this in lab, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but I do want you to spend time in your book just refreshing on blood types and how we figure out blood types if you've forgotten that in between that lab and now, because that lab happened all the way before spring break, so it would be totally reasonable if you had been forgetting about it a little bit. I want you to remember that an antigen is going to be a foreign substance that the immune system recognizes as not belonging, and it usually triggers an immune response. And then we also have antibodies. These are going to be the Y-shaped proteins that are secreted by white blood cells that are going to attach to and neutralize agents, right? And antigens. And this is how our blood typing works, right? Whenever we were in lab, we used different serums to detect which of these antigens and antibodies we saw on our blood cells, and that helped us type out what it was that we had there. So just look back at that lab, look back through your book, and kind of try to pull this memory back up from before spring break. This is all that I have for you on blood. If you have any questions, please reach out. This was a pretty quick lecture on blood. But since we're covering 2 chapters this week, I'm trying to not overload you with too much information, and the cardiovascular system is kind of a lot. So, yes, so just a little snippet on blood. All right, thanks for your attention, guys.